So China is the most common place for people to start their sourcing journey and start their brand. And it makes a lot of sense. It's very easy to go and manufacture with China, tons of benefits. But you're probably now at the point within your sourcing journey where you're wondering, is China the best fit? Should I stick with China for my manufacturing, or should I start moving outside? In this video today, I'm going to cover all the main factors that you should probably be considering when moving your manufacturing outside of China.
Hey there, I'm Isaac, the sourcing guy and founder and CEO of Imprint Genius, and I've been running a sourcing agency for the last decade. I've traveled all around the world sourcing over 1,000 products, and I built this channel to be able to teach you all my tips and tricks for sourcing products.
So one of the main factors you want to be looking at is going to be labor costs. Your labor cost in China has been growing exponentially, and a lot of times compared to other countries, let's say throughout Southeast Asia, you're looking at about 4 to even 5 times more per month for the same kind of blue collar worker. But with that said, that doesn't mean the product's going to be 4 or 5 times more expensive to manufacture in a place like China. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And that brings me to reason number 2, and that has to do with specialization. China has a huge amount of high skilled manufacturing. So what that means is you have people that live in China, that work in China, that are very, very good at manufacturing specific types of product. And that might be confusing because you might think, oh, China is going to be the lowest quality, cheapest options consistently. But that's not really the case, because you need this high skilled labor to be able to go and produce very technical items, whether it be a very technical shoe or it be a very technical iPhone. So then you tie that skilled labor and resources with the supplier ecosystem in that area. So if you move to another country just because the labor is lower, it doesn't mean that they're going to have the infrastructure set up to be able to go manufacture that product competitively and properly. And that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of Chinese factories that go and they opened up secondary factories in these other regions that are going to have a lower labor cost. But the kicker is that they're not actually moving their high quality manufacturing there. They're moving their mid-grade to lower grade manufacturing there and keeping their more complex premium quality stuff actually in China. So if you're enjoying the content and want to take your sourcing game to the next level, then you have to check out our sourcing school. For the first time ever, I'm opening up and showing all of my secrets and methods that we use at my sourcing agencies. Not only do you get access to our exact sourcing blueprint, but you also get access to our internal factory database, which has the factories behind some of the best brands in the world. Join our live weekly mentorship calls, community, and more to supercharge your sourcing game. And that brings us to our third reason, which is going to be supplier ecosystems. China did a very good job of organizing itself to have a very, very robust ecosystem to be able to go and get raw materials and components to be able to go and produce products efficiently. That's why when you go and you look through China, you can see that there's actually specialization within the different regions of China based off of the product type. And that's because there's a really strong ecosystem within that geographical area, right, for manufacturing a specific type of product. When you start moving your manufacturing outside of China, right, you're not necessarily going to have the same type of ecosystem from a raw material standpoint. Or you might, right? So we want to be looking at where the raw materials are coming from and where its cost basis around that. So let's think about a heavyweight 100% cotton hoodie for this example. It is not a very complex product to manufacture. You can go and train someone on a sewing machine in just a few weeks and be able to have them working on the line. So it doesn't require that very highly skilled labor that's going to be required when making an iPhone. Next, let's talk about raw materials. If we look at Pakistan, they are a net exporter of cotton, meaning they produce so much cotton in Pakistan that they go and export it to other regions. So you can take the low cost basis of the cotton that's coming from Pakistan, you can go and then couple that with manufacturing within the same country of the actual hoodies that require a lot of this cheaper cotton with the lower skilled labor, and then you're able to go and produce a much cheaper product than, for example, manufacturing that heavyweight hoodie in China. So additionally, with that said, a lot of these other countries do not have the raw materials locally. Even if you're manufacturing somewhere like Vietnam or Cambodia, a lot of the actual fabrics or raw materials or components are still coming from China. So if you have to go and import all of your raw materials and components from China over to these countries like Vietnam or Myanmar, you're gonna have increases in your lead time as well as your MOQs typically. And that brings me to my next point. So with China, we are blessed with very low MOQs and very fast production. And that is not something that you're going to necessarily see around the world. China has a lot of ODM manufacturing, which means original design manufacture. And that means that they are able to go and manufacture products off of a catalog. What I mean by that is if you go and talk to a factory from China and you ask for their catalog, they're normally going to be able to go and give you this catalog of items. A lot of times they develop themselves, so they have a lot of the raw materials handy, and they're able to go and quickly manufacture that product for you and have an easy white label solution. Now, the thing is that if you try to manufacture outside of China, a lot of the time you're not going to get a catalog. It's going to be factories that are really focused on OEM manufacturing. This means original equipment manufacturing. And the big difference here is that they're going to go and build your product based off your exact specifications. They're going to go and source materials as needed. And because of that, you're going to have a typically longer lead time for manufacturing and higher minimums, because the factory has to go through this entire new process to go and execute on your product. Now, this is not the case across the board. There are countries that are getting more and more focused on catalog-based manufacturing. Portugal, Turkey, and slowly India and Pakistan are adopting that as well. But you look at countries like Cambodia and Myanmar, and you're almost never going to find a factory there that has a catalog. And while we're on the topic of lead times and production times, it's not only about how long it takes the factory to manufacture the product. What also matters is the entire geopolitical sphere and regulatory concerns that come with manufacturing in different places. So this whole China being unstable is actually on the newer side. Typically, China had very predictable lead times, and because it was a very manufacturing focused country, there were less external factors that were going to go and slow things down. You had the holidays, you had the Chinese New Year, but these new changes such as COVID and the trade wars have made a really, really big impact on China as a whole. So if you're working in a country that's not China, which is focused heavily on manufacturing, and every major decision they might make is how is this going to affect our manufacturing process and logistics, etc. There's a lot more variables that can come into play when you're manufacturing in these other regions. A lot of other countries might be less stable, right? So they might have new governments coming into play that might change government policy pretty significantly. They might be more prone to having large-scale strikes, right? And protests that might affect it. There might be different types of holidays and different war issues that might come into play that might destabilize your manufacturing. And additionally, a lot of these other countries have different ways of manufacturing products. And that brings my next point about automation. So because China is so focused on technology and producing products very efficiently, especially with their labor costs going up so much, China has went and invested significant amounts of money into utilizing automation and robotics to manufacture products. And so you might think, oh, well, that's actually perfect for me, right? I want to go and move my manufacturing outside China and say, these products are handmade in Indonesia. Well, yes, there's a good marketing angle to that. But in my opinion, in my experience, if you utilize a lot more automation and robotics, you're able to typically produce a product that has less defects at a way faster, more efficient rate. So unfortunately, human errors are a thing. And if you're working with a country with a lot less skilled labor, a lot less automation, right? Let's think about like India and Bangladesh. Unfortunately, because they're not utilizing the same systems and robotics, you're going to have typically a higher defect rate or more quality control issues. So when you're thinking about moving to other countries, it's not just about what the product costs. You have to, a certain amount, factor in what is going to be the increased defect rate, what's that going to cost me down the road. And what's really, really important when you're working outside China is you might need to be hiring way more quality control agents. And to quickly cover that for anyone watching who doesn't know about quality control, you can hire third-party inspection agencies that are able to go and for about $200 a day can go into the factory and go and check the actual products to make sure there's limited defects. So from my experience moving to countries with very low labor costs and there's lower skilled labor, we have to go and spend a lot more money, spend a lot more time going through the inspection process and QCing the products before it goes out. But to turn this into a benefit, we're going to go into my next point, which is going to be communication, right? So a big issue with working with China from a lot of people is going to be being able to go and communicate with the factory effectively, whether that be a cultural difference, right? Or it's actual language barrier. A lot of times what you're looking to manufacture might not be exactly what you're getting in the end. But that doesn't mean everywhere outside China is better. So as an example, I was recently in Vietnam, visiting a bunch of factories, going to a trade show, and one of the biggest takeaways I took was that majority of the factories and the people working at the factories actually didn't speak English. And that's because they weren't really focused on exporting into the Western markets, working with these, foreign buyers. And that can create issues, right? If you aren't able to go and speak to your factory effectively, communicate effectively with your factory, there's a higher likelihood of issues happening. But there's also a pro, right? So let's say you're working with a specific factory, a specific country, or with a foreign owner, right? You're gonna have a way smoother experience. So there's two ways to look at that. So as an example, we work with a factory that produces for Kith and Stussy and a lot of the biggest brands in the world in the streetwear space. And they're in Vietnam. Now they have very high MOQs and they're an amazing factory, but the kicker for them is they have foreign ownership, right? So the owners and the management of the factory are not from Vietnam. They speak perfect English. And so the understanding is not just gonna be on a language perspective, they're also culturally gonna understand my needs better. So for example, if you work with a factory in Latin America, culturally it can feel a lot more similar to North America, or factories in Europe, right? They're gonna understand the European buyer, they're gonna understand the European trends. But the thing is if you're manufacturing in Portugal versus manufacturing in Pakistan, yes, it's gonna be smoother. Yes, the product quality might be better, but your cost basis for structurally a very similar hoodie might be 2, 3, 4 times the price. And that's personally why I think the sweet spot is going to be foreign ownership, right? In a country with a lower manufacturing cost and a lot of access to materials, like the factory I mentioned in Vietnam. And as we're talking about feeling close, right, to the factory, let's talk about actual logistics, right? If you are going and you're manufacturing in a place that is closer logistically to your end destination, there are benefits to it from a speed perspective, right? So if you're able to go and let's say manufacture in Mexico and then deliver to the US, you're able to then go and just throw it on a truck. Let's say you're manufacturing in Tijuana. You can manufacture a t-shirt there and the same day have it go and ship out of the fulfillment center in California. If you're a European brand and you go and you manufacture in Turkey, logistically you're way closer than going to manufacturing in China. And the speed to manufacture products is a huge benefit. So let's say the logistics time goes down significantly if we're shipping ocean, right? Instead of it taking 30 to 50 days, it's gonna go and deliver in 14 days. But the production time, right, is significantly longer in these other countries. Let's say it's a 60-day or 90-day production in Turkey versus a factory in China that is able to go and turn out the product in maybe 2 weeks if it's a stock program or a month, right? And then you factor in the cost savings between the two countries and maybe you're able to go and airship for the difference. But what ends up mattering is how long is it going to take the product from start to finish to arrive at my fulfillment center, my customer, etc. So just because it's geographically closer does not mean it's going to be faster. And with that said, what are other things that can create delays? So let's talk about customs and customs clearance. So what you have to think about is if you're going to export a product, first you have to clear local customs, right? Make sure you're able to export it. China has very clear guidelines and has a very streamlined process for exporting, while a lot of other countries surprisingly don't. Some other countries you need a specific export license to be able to go and export out of that country. Maybe there's a lot more regulation. Things can get more complicated and you can end up getting your product stuck, which again will create delays. Now let's talk about importation into your country, right? This is one of the main things people are looking at right now, especially with the trade war. So all different countries are going to have different trade agreements that are going to allow the taxes for the product to be increased or lowered based off of where it's being imported from. When talking about this, there's two main things to look at, right? You have your duty rate and your tariff rate. So there are exceptions to exactly how this works, and that's based off of if there are free trade agreements between specific countries, you typically don't have to worry about your duties or your tariffs. But your duty is going to be what is the cost, right, to import this cup from any country around the world into, for example, the US. That is going to be standardized for importation. Let's say it's 6%. Then you're going to have your tariff rate, right? So your tariff rate is an additional tax on top of that 6% that tends to do with some type of geopolitical issue that's going on, right? For example, the trade war, which for a lot of products is going to be 25%. So your taxes to import this product, let's say it has a 25% tariff and a 6% duty, you're looking at 31%. So what that means is if the manufacturing cost is the same, if I'm manufacturing in Mexico or in China, or even if it's a little more expensive, let's say it's 10% more expensive to manufacture in Mexico, but I don't get hit with a 25% tariff. So when looking at the import taxes, let's say we're comparing Vietnam versus China. And even if it costs a little bit more, let's say 10% more to manufacture the cup in Vietnam, but you're gonna go and save 25% on the actual tariffs that go into it, your ended up landed cost is going to be lower, and that's a huge advantage. So customs and tariffs and the whole trade war is one of the main reasons why people look at manufacturing outside of China. But another reason I hear a lot is going to be ethical labor practices. So let's talk about that real quick. So my experience personally working with factories around the world, as well as my family running a factory in China, and my experience visiting, hundreds of factories, is that typically I'm seeing better labor practices and more ethical labor practices in China versus a lot of other places. And it kind of makes sense when you go and you break this down. Within China, there's so much infrastructure for manufacturing, and there's so much visibility into factories now. For example, you have Alibaba Verified, which is through Alibaba, you can actually go and get verified pictures and reports from third parties that are going to go and inspect the factories. So you know that everything that you're kind of seeing in the certifications are, for the most part, legitimate. You also have a lot more widespread utilization of third-party inspections, such as a BSCI report. And I'm not saying BSCI is perfect. I'm not saying that there are factories that go and might cheat the system to an extent. But the large majority, right, are going to go and have some type of reporting and have some type of third-party inspections that are going to be going and checking these things related to social compliance, making sure the employees are working safely and happily and are paid correctly, etc. If you go to other countries that are more developing, let's think about other countries in South Asia or in Africa or in some areas of Latin America, right? There's a lot less regulation over how people are managed from a business and workplace ethics standpoint. We even saw this recently with huge issues in the north of Italy, where factory workers were not being treated properly. So that's why, just because you're moving your manufacturing outside of China does not mean it's going to be necessarily a more ethical place to manufacture. All right, and lastly, another huge part is intellectual property concerns. So when you're looking at manufacturing outside of China, other countries are going to have more strict regulations and protections for intellectual property. China is notorious for having very lax rules on intellectual property, so you have a big issue with factories going, copying products, and breaching intellectual property. Now, it doesn't mean that your product's never going to be copied if you manufacture in Europe versus China. At the end of the day, they just ship a sample over to China and they go and they're going to copy your product in like a week. But it does help. It will slow down the entire process. You're not going to have as many issues at the factory you're utilizing going and selling your product to other people. I do have another lesson in my product sourcing course and program that talks all about intellectual property and how to protect yourself the best way that you can when working with factories. But where I'm getting at is that yes, intellectual property is a big concern. Are all countries better than China? No, not necessarily, but it still is a big benefit when you are moving your manufacturing outside of China. And so you're probably wondering also, hey, sourcing guy, is China going to go into World War III with America and, we're not going to be manufactured anymore? I don't know. And no one really knows. It is a genuine concern. And that's why should I manufacture outside of China is such a hot topic right now. All I can say is these are the factors that you should be thinking about when you're going to move your manufacturing outside of China. And that's why it's important to have contingencies, to have a diverse global manufacturing ecosystem and supply chain built. And that's why no matter what happens in this crazy world, you're still going to be able to go and get your products and run your business effectively. And looking at all these factors strategically is one of the main reasons why large brands come to me, my program, as well as Imprint Genius, so that we can go and look at your entire supply chain, look at the products you're producing, and help you design a very effective global supply chain for your brand. I hope you enjoyed this video and this was helpful in your global product sourcing journey. Please remember to like and subscribe for more sourcing content coming soon, and see you on the next one.